Lesson 48, The Great Society. Lesson 48, The Great Society. Lesson 48, The Great Society. What is the proper role of government in shaping American society? What is the proper role of government in shaping American society? Introduction. On November 22nd, 1963, after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, Vice President Lyndon Johnson assumed the presidency. Most Americans knew little about Johnson and therefore doubted his ability to serve as president. However, Johnson handled the crisis masterfully. A nation stunned, shaken to its very heart, had to be reassured that the government was not just in a state of paralysis. He later recalled, "I had to convince everyone, everywhere, that the country would go forward." In his first presidential address, Johnson sought to ease people's doubts and vowed to continue the late president's efforts. Citing Kennedy's inaugural address, Johnson exclaimed, "On the 20th day of January in 1961, John F. Kennedy told his countrymen that our national work would not be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of his administration, nor even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet. But he said, let us begin. Today is the moment of new resolve. I would say to all my fellow Americans, let us continue." Johnson echoed his "let us continue" rhetoric the following year when he ran for full president for a full presidential term. In his speech accepting the Democratic Party's nomination, Johnson reflected on the long line of Democratic presidents. "I know what kind of a dream Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman and John F. Kennedy would dream if they were here tonight," he told convention delegates, "and I think I know what kind of a dream you want to dream." Looking to the challenge of making the dream a political reality, Johnson ended with these words, "So we conclude our labors. Let us tomorrow turn to our new task. Let us be on our way." The 1964 election, debating the role of government. Lyndon Johnson had enormous energy to realize his grand ideas. As president, he wanted to accomplish more than simply to enact Kennedy's programs. As he assumed office in 1963, Johnson began to develop an ambitious vision for his own presidency should he win re-election the following year. Liberal view, expanding the government to promote well-being. Johnson unveiled his presidential vision in a commencement speech delivered at the University of Michigan. "In your time," he told the graduating class, "we have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the great society." The president explained further, "The great society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to the poverty and racial injustice. But that is just the beginning. The great society is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and to enlarge his talents. It is a place where leisure is a welcome chance to build and reflect, not a feared cause of boredom and restlessness. It is a place where the city serves not only the demands of commerce, but the desire for beauty and the hunger for community. It is a place where man can renew contact with nature, a place where men are more concerned with the quality of their goals than the quantity of their goods. But most of all, the great society is not a finished work. It is a challenge, constantly renewed, beckoning us toward the destiny where the meaning of our lives matches the marvelous products of our labor." As Johnson's election campaign continued, Democrats hoped the Great Society's goals as their party platform. Adopted the Great Society's goals as their party platform. To the Democratic Party, Johnson's vision furthered a tradition of liberal reform, harking back to Franklin Roosevelt and before him to the Progressive Era. Like earlier progressives, these liberal Democrats believed that government power should be expanded to promote social well-being. The conservative view, limiting government to preserve liberty. The Republican presidential candidate, Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, felt differently about the power of government. An outspoken conservative, he had lambasted Eisenhower's modern republicanism as a dime-store New Deal, a cheap version of the Democrats' famous domestic program. Goldwater believed that government's most important task was to preserve and extend freedom. To him, regulating every aspect of people's lives was not the government's job, even though it had done so since the New Deal. Our defenses against the accumulation of power in Washington are in power shape. Goldwater warned that our defenses against the aggressive designs of Moscow, like many conservatives, Goldwater longed for a presidential candidate who agreed with his desire to limit the federal power. I have little interest in streamlining government or in making it more efficient, for I mean to reduce its size. I do not undertake to promote welfare, for I propose to extend freedom. My aim is not to pass laws, but to repeal them. It is not to inaugurate new programs, but to cancel old ones that do violence to the Constitution, or have failed in their purpose, or that imposed on the people an unwarranted financial burden. I will not attempt to discover whether legislation is needed before I have first determined whether it is constitutionally permissible. If I should later be attacked for neglecting my constituents' interests, I shall reply that I was informed their main interest is liberty, and that is the cause I am doing the very best that I can, and in that case, in that cause, I am doing the very best that I can. Barry Goldwater, The Conscience of a Conservative, 1960. In 1964, Goldwater seized the opportunity to become this candidate. When moderate Republicans warned Goldwater that voters would reject his views as extremism or radicalism, he countered, "Extremism is the defense of liberty is no vice. Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." Johnson wins by a landslide. Hold on first. Barry Goldwater lost his bid for the presidency in 1964, but his book, The Conscience of a Conservative, sold 3.5 million copies and helped inspire a new generation of conservatives. Some consider Goldwater to be the most influential losing candidate in the nation's history. The election of 1964 marked both the birth of the modern conservative movement and the beginning of the South's transition from Democrat to Republican. Johnson wins by a landslide. The presidential race quickly became malicious. Opponents portrayed Goldwater as a reckless extremist who, if elected, would abolish Social Security and further anti-communist aggression towards the Soviet Union to instigate World War III. On September 7th, the Johnson campaign aired Daisy, a memorable television advertisement that played on Goldwater's perceived extremism. In the ad, a young girl counts the petals of a daisy before her voice is drowned out by a nuclear countdown, followed by a distinct mushroom cloud. The ad proclaimed, "Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home." Daisy ran only once, but it sufficiently terrified voters. Johnson beat Goldwater in a landslide, winning 44 states to Goldwater's 6. Johnson secured 61% of the popular vote, the greatest margin won by any president to that point. In addition, Democrats gained a large majority in Congress. However, the election catalyzed two developments that would eventually challenge the Democrats' power. One was the birth of the modern conservative movement, which stemmed from Goldwater's ideas, and the other was the political transformation of the South. For the first time since Reconstruction, 5 Southern states voted for Republican in 1964. This shift marked the beginning of the Southern transition from solidly Democratic to consistently Republican. Implementing Johnson's Great Society. Johnson viewed his decisive election victory as a mandate to progress his Great Society agenda. Long before the election, he had begun to work on civil rights and anti-poverty programs. Now he was ready to move forward with a broad range of proposals for improving life for all Americans. The Johnson treatment gets results in Congress. Although Kennedy had difficulty moving his legislative programs through Congress, many of Johnson's bills passed. Because he served in Congress for over 2 decades, Johnson knew how to influence legislators. He praised them publicly, sought their advice, and returned their calls, instructing his aides to do the same, or else. When he exhausted these other strategies, the president subjected lawmakers to the treatment. 2 journalists described Johnson's persuasive prowess. Its tone could be supplication, pleading, accusation, cajolery, persuasion, exuberance, scorn, tears, complaint, the hint of threat. Johnson moved in close, his face a scant millimeter from his target's eyes, widening and narrowing, his eyebrows rising and falling. From his pockets poured clippings, memos, statistics. The treatment was an almost hypnotic experience and rendered the target stunned and helpless. Roland Evans and Robert Novak, Exercise of Power, 1966. This treatment, combined with a Democratic-controlled Congress after 1965, helped Johnson accomplish an extraordinary legislative record. In his 5 years as president, Johnson guided more than 200 measures through Congress. Democrat-controlled Congress. Ending racial injustice. Johnson envisioned a society free of racial injustice, so one of his initial priorities as president was to pass Kennedy's new civil rights legislation that banned discrimination in public accommodations. As Johnson stated, no memorial oration could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill. Several months later, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. Shortly after it was passed, this new law was challenged in the courts. Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States arose when the motel owner refused to rent rooms to blacks, arguing the Civil Rights Act overstepped Congress's power to control interstate commerce. The motel owner also claimed that the law violated his rights under the 5th and 13th Amendments since it dictated how he must use his property. The Supreme Court rejected these claims, noting that because much of the motel's business came from out-of-state guests, Congress had acted within its power to regulate interstate commerce. Johnson further pushed Congress to end racial injustice. In 1965, he signed the Voting Rights Act, which guaranteed the voting rights to African Americans. 3 years later, he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which prohibited housing discrimination. These laws advanced the country towards Johnson's vision of a more just society. Declaring war on poverty. Kennedy and Johnson also shared the goal to eliminate poverty. Spurred by Michael Harrington's novel The Other America, Kennedy asked his advisors to develop strategies for attacking poverty, which Johnson expanded into an ambitious anti-poverty program called the War on Poverty. The centerpiece of Johnson's War on Poverty was the Economic Opportunity Act. Passed by Congress in August of 1964, the law founded dozens of federal anti-poverty programs and established an Office of Economic Opportunity to oversee them. These programs included the Job Corps, which was dedicated to teaching disadvantaged young people job skills, Project Head Start, which created programs for low-income preschool children, and the Volunteers in Service to America, or VISTA, which was modeled after the Peace Corps. VISTA volunteers lived and worked in poor communities within the United States, providing job training and educational services to residents. President Johnson also worked to reverse the decline in America's cities. In 1965, he established the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, to manage federal programs aimed at revitalizing blighted urban neighborhoods. Its head, Robert Weaver, was the first African American to be appointed to a presidential cabinet. Improving access to health care. Johnson's Great Society prioritized helping disadvantaged Americans gain access to health care. Liberals in Congress had attempted to secure hospital insurance for retired workers under the Social Security for years, a measure which Johnson expedited. In 1965, Congress established the Medicare and Medicaid programs. Medicare is a federal health insurance program which helps pay for hospital and nursing home services for U.S. citizens 65 years and older. Medicaid is a health insurance program jointly financed by federal and state governments that covers low-income people as well as older Americans whose medical needs have exceeded Medicare benefits. With the establishment of these programs, many Americans no longer had to forego medical care due to the lack of health insurance. Supporting lifelong learning and culture. Johnson believed that education was the key to a better life and therefore introduced several measures to improve the nation's educational system. One such measure was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which provided federal aid to school districts nationwide because the government allocated funds to needy students rather than to schools. The law helped finance both public and parochial or faith-based education. That same year, Johnson signed an act creating the National Endowment for the Arts, NEA, the National Endowments for the Humanities, NEH. These organizations issued grants to artists, musicians, writers, scholars, and researchers to promote vibrant national culture. Johnson also spearheaded passage of the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, which established the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CBP, to support the development of public radio and television programs. Upon signing the act, Johnson explained, "While we work every day to produce goods and create new wealth, we want most of all to enrich man's spirit. This is the purpose of this act." One of the first CBP funds was Sesame Street, which first aired on public television stations in 1969. As First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson helped promote President Johnson's Great Society programs in an effort to beautify America. She helped coordinate highway wildflower planting. She also took an interest in issues regarding children and education. Senior citizens benefited from establishment of Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare health insurance is funded by the federal government, while Medicaid is a joint federal and state health insurance venture. Here are some seniors' protests for the affordable and elderly health care. Opening doors for immigrants. Johnson also supported major reform in the nation's immigration policy. Beginning in the 1920s, the government placed quotas on immigration from every region of the world except Western Europe. Johnson wanted to end the quota system because he believed it was rooted in prejudice. The Immigration Act of 1965 eliminated quotas based on national origin, designated people's skills and ties to family in the United States as the key criteria for admission to the country. Skills and ties to family are the key to the criteria of admission to the country. Johnson praised the act for repairing a very deep and very painful flaw in the fabric of American justice. This law would have tremendous impact in the decades to come, quadrupling the U.S. immigration rates from around the world. Preserving the environment. The Great Society also aimed to improve the quality of the environment. In 1962, Rachel Carson published the book Silent Spring, which sparked public interest in environmentalism, or the protection of the environment. The novel demonstrates how uncontrolled pesticide use was poisoning the environment. The air we breathe, our water, our soil, and our wildlife, Johnson warned, are all blighted by poisons and chemicals which are the byproduct of technology and industry. Johnson worked with Congress to pass several environmental laws, including the Clean Air Act of 1963, which set emission standards for factories to reduce air pollution. Others focused on cleaning waterways, preserving wilderness, protecting endangered species, and beautifying the landscape. Johnson Clean Air Act, Johnson Clean Air Act, Johnson Clean Air Act. Here we go. How have Great Society programs saved our history and national heritage? Among the most enduring legacies of the Great Society are 4 landmark laws enacted to preserve historic sites, endangered species, free-flowing rivers, and wilderness areas for generations to come. Wilderness Act of 1964. Wilderness Act of 1964. What it did, it created the National Wilderness Preservation System to preserve areas where earth and community of life are untrammeled by man. Long-term impact, nearly 110 million acres were preserved as wilderness areas by the end of 2011. Endangered Species Preservation Act of 1966. What it did, directed the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, FWS, to identify and protect plants and animals that are endangered or threatened with extinction. Long-term impacts, by 2012, the FWS had listed 1,994 endangered or threatened species worldwide, of which 1,387 were in the United States. It also brought several species back from the brink of extinction, including the American bald eagle. Endangered Species and Preservation Act of 1966. Save the bald eagle. National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. What it did, created the National Register of Historic Places, listed a list of sites, structures, and objects worthy of preservation. Long-term impact, more than 80,000 places were registered in historic sites by the beginning of 2012. Nationally registered 16th Street Baptist Church, Birmingham, Alabama, was the site of the 1963 church bombing that resulted in the death of 4 African-American girls. Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968. What it did, created the National Wild and Scenic River System to preserve rivers of great scenic, recreational, wildlife, or historic value in free-flowing condition. By mid-2011, the system protected 12,598 miles of river. The Rogue River Gorge is one of the 3 rivers protected by the 1968 Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Protecting consumers. Johnson promoted consumerism, or the protection of rights of consumers. The Cigarette Labeling Act of 1965 required cigarette packages to include warning labels for the health risks of smoking. Other acts set standards for quality in meat and poultry products, for truth in lending practices, and for honesty in food labeling. In 1965, Ralph Nader's book, Unsafe at Any Speed, drew public attention to auto safety. The book explained how lax engineering standards in the automobile industry put drivers at risk, spurring Congress to pass the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1966. This law required automobile makers to install seatbelts in all cars. Debating the Great Society. By the early 1970s, the impact of Johnson's Great Society reforms were evident in the various facets of American society. The U.S. poverty rate fell by 22% in 1960 to 12.6% in 1970. High school graduation rates rose from about 42% of black students and 69% of white students in 1962 to about 60% for blacks and 80% for whites. In 1970, African American political participation increased as well. By 1970, 10 members of the House of Representatives and 1 senator were black. Despite its success, the Great Society had numerous critics, especially regarding the war on poverty. Left-wing opponents argued that the programs implemented were not the best approach to ending poverty. Since they believed that poverty resulted from social and economic forces beyond the poor's control, these critics thought that the best way to help low-income people was to give them money while attempting to reform the economy and create more jobs. Critics on the right alleged that the war on poverty was creating an underclass of people dependent on government welfare. In their view, poverty was mainly caused by the poor's lack of individual responsibility. The best approach to ending poverty, they argued, was to change the behaviors that kept poor people poor. At the heart of the debate over Johnson's Great Society were age-old questions debating the role of government in a democracy. Liberal supporters applauded the scheme's broad goals and multitude of programs aimed at improving the American society. They were mainly concerned that many of the programs were not sufficiently funded. Conservative critics, on the other hand, viewed the Great Society as a government run amok. Great Society programs high cost confirmed conservatives' belief that the government should not endeavor to solve all of society's problems. The liberal ideology of government's obligations to solve society's problems peaked under Johnson's presidency. After he left office, world events sparked an influx of conservatism. Still, the Great Society had a lasting impact on American life as many of its outcomes became fixtures of society. Few modern-day Americans clamored to end Sesame Street or consumer protections, for example. The activist war in court. The activist war in court. The Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Earl Warren, also helped to reshape American society during the 1960s by reinterpreting much of what had been established as law. The Warren Court became known as an activist court, ensuring one person, one vote. The Warren Court's rulings in 2 cases transformed the political landscape in particular. The first case, Baker versus Carr, began when Charles Baker, a Republican citizen of Tennessee, sued Joe Carr, Tennessee's Secretary of State, over the state's failure to redraw its legislative districts for 5 decades. Many rural Tennessean families had migrated to cities during that period, and Baker's urban district now possessed more residents than some small rural districts. However, this change was not reflected in the representative numbers. Baker claimed that this imbalance violated the 14th Amendment rights to equal protection under the law. The Supreme Court had previously considered reapportionment, redrawing voting district boundaries to reflect population changes, as a matter for state legislatures. In 1962, the Warren Court reversed their stance after a long deliberation, ruling that reapportionment was in fact under federal jurisdiction. The court returned to reapportionment in the case of Reynolds versus Sims. In his majority opinion, Chief Justice Warren wrote, "A citizen, a qualified voter, is no more nor no less so because he lives in the city than the farm. This is clear and strong command of our Constitution's Equal Protections Clause. This is at the heart of Lincoln's vision for a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The Equal Protections Clause demands no less than substantially equal state legislative representation for all citizens of all places as well as of all races." As a result, legislative districts across the country were redrawn under the principle of one person, one vote. In this way, each legislator would represent roughly the same number of people, allowing each person's vote to count equally. Ruling on prayer in public schools. In 1962, the court considered the constitutionality of prayer in public schools. Engel versus Vitale arose when state officials, including William Vitale, ordered New York students to recite a morning prayer. Led by Stephen Engel, students' parents sued the state, claiming that the prayer violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. This clause states that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. The Supreme Court agreed with the parents, determining that state-sponsored prayer in school, even if voluntary, was unconstitutional because it was wholly inconsistent with the Establishment Clause. This controversial decision sparked efforts to amend the Constitution to permit prayer in public schools. Protecting the rights of the accused. Another series of Warren Court rulings reshaped the criminal justice system. In Mapp versus Ohio, Dollery Mapp had been convicted of a crime based on evidence gathered during an illegal police search of her home. The court ruled in 1961 that evidence obtained illegally may not be used in court. In Gideon versus Wainwright, defendant Charles Gideon had not had enough money to hire a lawyer. Forced to represent himself, he had been tried, found guilty, and sent to prison. After he appealed his case to the Supreme Court in 1963, the court ruled that Gideon's Sixth Amendment right to an attorney had been violated. As a result, courts must now provide public defenders to people who are accused of a crime but cannot afford a lawyer. In 1964 case Escobedo versus Illinois, police had denied a murder suspect, Danny Escobedo, the opportunity to speak to a lawyer during an interrogation. Escobedo eventually confessed to the crime and was convicted. The court overturned Escobedo's conviction as his constitutional right to legal representation after arrest had been violated. In a 1966 case, Miranda versus Arizona, the court that police must inform suspects of their rights before questioning. Warren wrote that a suspect must be told that he has the right to remain silent, that any statement he does make may be used as evidence against him, and that he has a right to the presence of an attorney. These protections are called Miranda rights, after the defendant. Americans vigorously debated these and other Warren Court rulings. Some critics called on Congress to impeach Chief Justice Warren. Of all three branches of government, argued Senator Barry Goldwater, today's Supreme Court is the least faithful to the constitutional tradition of limited government. Others praised Warren Court for accomplishing what Congress failed to do, the right to protect the rights guaranteed for every citizen under the Constitution. In 1964, voters elected Liberal Democrat Lyndon Johnson by a wide margin. Johnson used this mandate to enact a broad program of reform he called the Great Society. With his powers of persuasion, Johnson pushed more than 200 bills through Congress. War on poverty, Johnson's Great Society grew from the liberal tradition of the Progressive and New Deal eras. Its centerpiece was the ambitious War on Poverty. Economic Opportunity Act. This act instituted a number of anti-poverty measures, including the Job Corps Head Start Project, VISTA, all of which had cut poverty rates almost in half. Medicare and Medicaid. As part of the Great Society's reforms, Congress amended the Social Security Act to include medical health insurance for the elderly and for the disabled. Immigration Act of 1965. This measure ended the national origins quota system begun in the 1920s. Entry to the United States was now based on criteria like skills and familial connections. Silent Spring. This influential book sparked a new interest in environmentalism. As a result, Congress passed several environmental laws during this period. One person, one vote. The activist Warren Court changed the American political landscape by insisting that states create legislative districts per the principle of one person, one vote. Miranda rights is a series of controversial decisions. The Warren Court expanded the rights of the accused, including ensuring that people placed under arrest be informed of their rights before being questioned.